wind didn't knock. It slammed into the house like it meant to erase it from the map. Above the floor, walls groaned, windows shattered, the night screamed, and while the town prayed their roofs would hold, one man went down instead of running out. They laughed when he dug beneath his own home. They called it foolish, dangerous, a grave waiting to happen. But when the storm came and nowhere else was safe, that hidden room became the only place where fear stopped breathing. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Cheyenne. Wyoming did not dramatize winter. It simply endured it, year after year, with a patience that bordered on indifference. The town lay exposed on open land, without hills or forests to break the wind. When the cold arrived, it came straight across the plains, uninterrupted, carrying grit, ice, and a silence that felt deliberate. By late November, mornings were brittle. Breath turned visible the moment it left the mouth, and the wind pressed against buildings as if testing them, searching for weakness rather than announcing its strength. Stellan Crow arrived under a sky the color of dull tin. Snow had not yet fallen, but the cold had settled in with intent. He drove slowly through the outskirts of town in an aging pickup whose engine ticked loudly when he parked, as if it needed a moment to recover. The truck bore the marks of long use, faded paint, rust at the wheel wells, and a thin crack across the windshield that caught the light when the sun was low. In the truck bed sat a small number of possessions: a well-worn saddle wrapped in canvas, a metal toolbox with dented corners, a rolled blanket secured with rope. There was nothing ornamental about what he carried. Everything had a use, or it did not stay. Stellan was 33 years old, built lean and strong from years of physical work rather than any deliberate training. He was tall, though not noticeably so unless standing close, and moved with a steady economy that suggested he had learned to conserve effort. His shoulders were broad, his hands large and roughened, the knuckles thickened by work and weather. His face was angular, marked by a hard jawline and high cheekbones. He wore a short, uneven beard, dark with faint gray beginning to show at the chin. His hair was kept short, flattened by hats rather than styled. His eyes were pale gray-blue, attentive without curiosity, as if he watched the world not for interest but for necessity. Stellan had spent most of his adult life working as a ranch hand across several states. He was known as reliable and quiet, someone who showed up early, stayed late, and did not complain. Ranch owners trusted him with solitary work because he did not panic and did not improvise recklessly. That restraint had been learned. A year earlier, during a late-season cattle move in the mountains, a sudden blizzard had taken Cal Rourke, his closest friend and longtime riding partner. Cal had been louder, more optimistic, convinced that experience alone could carry a man through any storm. When the weather collapsed without warning, Cal pushed forward. Stellan turned back toward shelter. The difference between them had been measured in minutes and yards. Cal did not survive. Stellan did. Since then, Stellan no longer believed in luck, and he no longer trusted structures, schedules, or assumptions when weather was involved. The house he purchased sat at the edge of Cheyenne, where pavement gave way to hard ground and frostbitten grass. It was modest and clearly old. The paint had peeled back in layers, revealing previous attempts at care. The roof sloped unevenly toward the rear, not enough to collapse, but enough to be noticed. The porch steps leaned slightly, their boards worn smooth by decades of boots. The windows were original glass, thick and imperfect, bending the light and warping reflections. A narrow chimney rose from the roof, patched with mismatched mortar that suggested repairs made out of necessity rather than skill. Inside, the house smelled of dry wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. The floors creaked constantly, reacting to weight and temperature alike. The living room was narrow and bare, with walls that bowed slightly inward. The kitchen was small, its cabinets scarred and loose at the hinges, the sink stained from years of hard water. The bedroom barely held a bed. The bathroom showed signs of an update that had happened long ago and then stopped. There was nothing charming about the place, but it was intact, and it was affordable. Stellan set his toolbox on the living room floor and stood still, listening. The wind pressed against the walls in steady pulses. The roof responded with soft shifts and low groans. Somewhere beneath the house, pipes knocked once and fell silent. None of it suggested immediate danger, but taken together it formed a pattern he recognized. The structure was resisting, not resting. He stepped toward the center of the living room and looked down at the floorboards. After a moment, he crouched and placed his palm flat against the wood. The boards were cold to the touch, but beneath that cold was something denser and more consistent. The ground did not move. It did not creak. It did not respond to the wind. "This won't hold," he said quietly. The decision formed without drama. It was not an idea so much as a conclusion. Walls and roofs could fail, heat could escape, wind could enter, but earth, properly used, stayed steady. Stellan had learned that the hard way. He didn't explain his thoughts to anyone. That afternoon, he drove into town and bought tools deliberately, avoiding attention. A reinforced shovel, a heavy pickaxe, a pry bar, long nails, thick plastic sheeting. At the hardware store, he spent time examining ventilation supplies, studying ducting and vent caps with the seriousness of someone planning something permanent. The clerk, a middle-aged man with reddened hands and a tired face, asked what the project was. "Repair," Stellan answered, and the clerk nodded without interest. As Stellan walked back to his truck, a dog approached from the edge of the parking lot. Medium-sized, compact, alert. A cattle dog mix, judging by the build. Its coat was mottled tan and white, with a darker patch around one eye that gave it a permanently questioning look. Its ears stood upright, and its tail wagged cautiously. The dog stopped a few feet away and sat, watching him closely. "You don't look lost," Stellan said. The dog sneezed, shook itself, and wagged its tail harder. When Stellan took a step, it followed. When he opened the truck door, it jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation. Stellan studied it for a moment, then nodded once. "Biscuit," he said. The dog accepted the name immediately. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. The wind strengthened, finding gaps around windows and doors. Stellan ate, standing at the kitchen counter. Biscuit explored the house, nose to the floor, pausing often as if listening. The dog barked once in the living room, short and sharp, staring at the boards beneath its feet. Stellan slept lightly. The wind struck the house in waves, rattling glass and shifting the roof just enough to wake him. Near dawn, a strong gust hit the back wall hard enough to make the structure shudder. Stellan sat up immediately, alert and calm. He remembered the sound of wind disappearing into white silence in the mountains, remembered how quickly direction and safety had vanished. He did not wait for morning. He pulled on his boots, carried a lantern into the living room, and set it on the floor. Biscuit followed and sat nearby, watching closely. Stellan knelt near the center of the room, ran his fingers along the seams between the boards, and selected a spot that balanced distance from the walls with proximity to the kitchen. He wedged the pry bar beneath the edge of a plank and applied pressure. The board resisted, then lifted with a dry groan. He removed it and looked down. The soil beneath was dark, compact, and undisturbed. It smelled faintly damp. The temperature was noticeably different, cool but stable. Biscuit leaned forward, sniffed, then sat back quietly. Stellan exhaled. Outside, the wind continued to work at the house. Inside, the lantern cast a steady circle of light onto the ground beneath the floor. "This is where it holds," Stellan said. He removed the second plank. The second plank came up harder than the first. The nails resisted with a dry, complaining sound before giving way, and Stellan set the board aside carefully, lining it up with the other as if he already knew he would need it again. He worked slowly, deliberately, keeping the opening clean and measured. By the time the lantern light revealed a rectangle of bare earth beneath the living room floor, the house felt different, not quieter, but more attentive, as if it had noticed what he was doing and was waiting to see whether he would do it right. Stellan knelt at the edge of the opening and studied the soil. It was compact clay mixed with gravel, the kind that held shape when cut and fought back when rushed. He pressed his fingers into it and felt the resistance. This was not ground that collapsed easily, but it demanded respect. He marked the edges with a carpenter's pencil, measuring twice before committing to anything permanent. The opening had to be precise. A mistake here would carry forward, multiplying with depth. Biscuit hovered close, nails clicking softly on the remaining floorboards. The dog's coat caught the lantern light, highlighting the uneven patches of tan and white. the dark marking around one eye that gave him a permanently skeptical expression. Biscuit was young, maybe 3 or 4, judging by his energy and the lack of stiffness in his movements. He circled the opening, sniffed, then sat, head tilted slightly, watching Stellan with focused interest. He didn't bark. He didn't interfere. He observed, as if memorizing the routine. Stellan took that as a good sign. He didn't dig that night. Instead, he covered the opening with plastic sheeting and replaced the boards loosely, enough to keep the cold air from rising unchecked. The real work would begin in daylight, when mistakes were easier to see. Morning came pale and cold. The wind had not relented, but it had settled into a steady presence rather than sharp bursts. Stellan ate, quickly, fed Biscuit from a dented metal bowl, then cleared the living room completely. The couch went outside, followed by the small table and the chair. He rolled the rug tight and leaned it against the porch railing. By the time he pulled the boards up again, the room was bare, reduced to structure and intent. The first hours of digging were slow. The pickaxe bit into the earth with a dull thud, loosening small sections at a time. Stellan shoveled carefully, lifting soil into buckets and carrying them out the back door, dumping them along the fence line where the ground was already uneven. He kept his movements controlled, his breathing steady. He had learned long ago that impatience cost energy, and energy was something winter demanded you ration. By mid-morning, his shoulders burned and his hands ached, but the hole had taken shape. It was still shallow, but its edges were clean, squared, and intentional. Stellan paused often, checking the walls, testing the firmness with his fingers, listening for shifts. The earth held. The sound of metal striking soil carried farther than he expected. Around noon, a shadow crossed the doorway, and Stellan looked up to find a woman standing just inside the threshold, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She didn't step forward immediately. She took in the room first, the empty space, the open floor, the dirt-streaked boards leaning against the wall, then looked at Stellan. "Morning," she said. Her name was Juniper Hart, though most people called her June. She was in her early 30s, perhaps 31 or 32, with a build that suggested long hours on her feet rather than deliberate exercise. She was average height, slender without being fragile, her posture straight but relaxed. Her hair was a deep chestnut brown, pulled back into a low braid that rested against the collar of her coat, a few loose strands framing her face. Her skin was pale from winter and wind, lightly freckled across the bridge. Of her nose, her eyes were dark and steady, observant without being intrusive. June worked at the small weather station on the edge of town and split her time at the public library, cataloging records and maintaining old climate logs most people had forgotten existed. She had grown up in Cheyenne, learned early that the land did not care about optimism, and developed a habit of paying attention. "I heard hammering," she said, "and then I noticed your furniture outside." Stellan straightened slowly, resting his hands on the shovel handle. "I'm not renovating." "I figured," June said, glancing at the opening in the floor. She stepped closer, careful not to cross the boundary of the hole. "You're going down." "Yes." There was no surprise in her expression. Curiosity, yes. Judgment, no. June crouched and looked into the opening, her breath fogging faintly. "That's good soil," she said. "Dense. It'll hold if you line it right." Stellan studied her for a moment. "You've seen this before." "I've read about it," she replied. "Mostly old farm cellars, root rooms, some shelters farther north. People stopped building them when furnaces got better. Then they forgot why they built them in the first place." Biscuit approached her, sniffed her boots, then sat, tail wagging cautiously. "And you picked the living room," she added. "Central, smart." Stellan nodded once. He appreciated efficiency in conversation. June stood and brushed dirt from her gloves. "You'll want to think about ventilation sooner rather than later, and drainage. Even compact soil moves when it's wet." "I have plans," Stellan said. "I assumed you did." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'm June." "Stellan?" "I know." She left not long after, but her visit lingered. Stellan returned to work with a clearer sense of sequence. By late afternoon, the hole was nearly 3 feet deep. His hands were blistered despite the gloves. His back protested when he straightened, but the walls were clean and vertical, the corners sharp. Biscuit dozed near the opening, occasionally lifting his head to watch another bucket leave. Toward evening, the wind shifted. It came from the north now, colder, carrying the faint promise of snow. Stellan replaced the boards loosely again and secured the plastic. He cooked a simple meal and ate sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, biscuit pressed against his leg, warm and solid. That night, Stellan studied his sketches by lantern light. Measurements, material lists, airflow diagrams. He adjusted a few angles. Reconsidered the staircase placement. The hasty solution was rarely the right one. Over the next days, the digging deepened. The work settled into a rhythm. Dig, lift, carry, dump. His body adapted. The pain dulled into background noise. The opening became a pit, then a space that could no longer be mistaken for anything else. Passers-by slowed when they saw the dirt piles. A man named Harold Finch, a retired electrician with a permanent scowl and nicotine-stained fingers, stopped once and shook his head. "You know that's risky," Harold said. "Undercutting your own foundation." Stellan wiped his hands on his jeans. "I'm not touching the footings." Harold grunted, unconvinced, but moved on. June returned on the fourth day, bringing a thermos of coffee and a folded set of weather charts. "Pressure's dropping," she said, handing him the thermos. "Not yet, but soon. This winter's going to be mean." Stellan accepted the coffee. They always are. She watched him work for a while, her gaze following the careful way he cut the soil, the way he tested each wall before moving deeper. "Most people don't listen when the ground talks," she said. "They only hear the sky." Stellan paused, shovel resting against the wall. "The ground saved my life once." June did not. "Ask for details." She simply nodded. By the end of the week, the pit reached a depth that made the living room feel altered, as if the house now contained a secret it could not unlearn. The air below was noticeably steadier, less affected by the temperature swings above. Stellan noticed it the moment he climbed down with the lantern. The earth did not echo. It absorbed sound. One evening, as he climbed out, Biscuit stood at the edge and barked, not sharp this time, but insistent. Stellan followed the dog's gaze to the front window, where snow had begun to fall, light but purposeful. "Yeah," Stellan said quietly, "I see it too." He covered the opening, secured the boards, and stood in the center of the room. The house creaked softly, unsettled but intact. The work had begun, and there would be no turning back. By the time the pit reached 5 feet, the house began to behave differently. It did not complain as often. The floorboards around the opening no longer creaked at random, as if the strain they had been carrying had shifted somewhere more willing to bear it. When Stellan climbed down into the pit with the lantern, the air felt steady, almost indifferent to the temperature above. It was not warm, not yet, but it was calm, and calm mattered. Stellan spent the morning reinforcing the edges. He set temporary braces along the perimeter, cut precisely to hold the soil where it wanted to shear. His movements were careful, measured. He had learned through years of working cattle that force without planning only created more work later. He measured twice, cut once, then checked again. Biscuit stayed at the top, head following each motion, ears flicking whenever the house made a sound he didn't recognize. The dog's coat had dulled slightly with dust, but his eyes stayed bright and alert. He had taken to lying flat with his chin on the floorboards, watching the hole as if guarding it. That afternoon, Stellan made the first delivery run. He drove into town and loaded his truck with bricks, standard red clay, dense and heavy, the kind used for foundations and chimneys. He counted carefully, calculating the number he would need for the first layer alone. Brickwork was unforgiving. A crooked base meant a crooked wall, and a crooked wall underground was not an inconvenience. It was a threat. At the brickyard, a man named Owen Pike watched him load. Owen was in his early 40s, broad through the chest, with a beard that had once been trimmed neatly and then abandoned. His hairline had receded unevenly, giving his forehead a perpetually surprised look. He wore work gloves even when not working, a habit from years of lifting things that could crush fingers. Owen had been born in Cheyenne and had stayed. He knew everyone, or at least everyone's business. "You building a fireplace?" Owen asked, leaning against a pallet. "Something like that," Stellan replied. Owen glanced at the quantity. "That's more than a fireplace." Stellan met his gaze without flinching. "It's for under the house." Owen's eyebrows lifted. He didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He just looked thoughtful. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary." Owen nodded slowly. "Ground's solid where you are. My uncle had a root cellar not far from there, saved his produce more than once. He hesitated. You know people are talking. Stellan lifted another stack of bricks. They always do. Owen said nothing more, but when Stellan finished loading, Owen added 2 extra bricks to the stack without comment. Back at the house, Stellan carried the bricks inside one load at a time, stacking them neatly along the living room wall. The weight added a different presence to the space. The room felt less temporary, less like something waiting to be abandoned. Biscuit sniffed each brick and then sneezed, offended by the dust. Stellan spent the next 2 days laying the first course. He mixed mortar in small batches, adjusting the consistency until it spread cleanly and held firm. He worked from the bottom up, placing each brick with care, tapping it into alignment, checking the level. The work required patience more than strength. His hands cramped, his shoulders burned. He ignored both. Underground, time behaved differently. It slowed, stretched. There was only the brick, the line, the next brick. June came by in the late afternoon on the second day, bringing bread wrapped in cloth and a jar of soup that still steamed when she opened it. She stood at the edge of the opening, looking down at the growing wall. Her coat was dusted with snow, her braids slightly loose, strands of hair escaping around her face. "You've started lining it," she said. Stellan nodded. "First course matters most." She watched in silence for Akasha, while her eyes following the straightness of the line, the way the corners met cleanly. "Most people rush this part," she said. "They get impatient once the hole is deep." "Rushing gets people buried," Stellan replied. June did not argue. She handed him the soup and bread, then sat on the floor with her back against the wall, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Biscuit approached her, sniffed, then settled at her feet as if they had agreed on something. "They've issued a preliminary advisory," June said after a moment. "Not public yet, just internal. Patterns are aligning the wrong way." "How wrong?" "Enough that I'd rather not be above ground when it hits." Stellan placed another brick, pressed it into place. "You know where the door is?" She smiled faintly. "I do." As the walls rose, the house above attracted attention. Dirt piles grew. Bricks appeared in stacks. The sound of work carried. Neighbors slowed when they passed. Some stared openly. Others pretended not to look. A man named Carl Denver stopped one afternoon. Carl was in his late 50s, thick through the middle. With a mustache he trimmed obsessively, and a voice that carried whether he meant it to or not. He had lived in Cheyenne his entire life and believed that longevity equaled authority. "You know inspectors don't like this sort of thing," Carl said, standing on the porch, hands on hips. Stellan climbed out of the pit and wiped his hands. "I'm not altering the load-bearing walls." "You're digging under your house." "Yes." Carl shook his head. "That's asking for trouble." "So is ignoring winter," Stellan replied. Carl frowned, unaccustomed to resistance. "You think you're smarter than the rest of us?" "I think I'm cautious," Carl snorted. Same difference. He left, unconvinced, but quieter than he had arrived. By the end of the week, the brick walls reached waist height. Stellan installed temporary supports for the ceiling framework he would add later. He began mapping out the staircase, narrow but sturdy, angled to conserve space without compromising safety. He tested each step placement with his weight before committing. One evening, as the sun dropped early behind thick clouds, Stellan brought Aster home. She was a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face and dark, thoughtful eyes. At 12 years old, she was no longer young, but she was steady, sure-footed, and intelligent. She had been bred for ranch work and had seen enough bad weather to know when not to panic. Stellan led her into the small yard behind the house, brushing snow from her coat, checking her shoes. Aster snorted softly, ears flicking toward the house. She shifted her weight, uneasy. "It's all right," Stellan said, resting his forehead briefly against her neck. "We'll get through this one." He set up a temporary shelter for her, reinforced against wind, packed with straw. Biscuit watched the entire process intently, tail stiff, as if assuming responsibility for her safety as well. That night, the wind rose again. Snow fell heavier, thicker, sticking to windows and muting sound. Inside the house, Stellan sat at the table, reviewing plans by lamplight. The brick walls below absorbed the cold. The air above still bit, but less sharply. He climbed down once more before sleeping, standing in the pit, listening. The earth was quiet. It did not promise comfort. It offered stability. "This will hold," he said, not as hope but as assessment. Above him, the house creaked softly, but it did not protest. The first real test came not from the ground, but from the house. Stellan noticed it early one morning when he stepped into the living room and felt the air shift under his boots. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would miss, an almost imperceptible softness, a change in the way the floor answered weight. The brick walls below had risen high enough now that the space beneath the house was no longer just a pit. It was becoming a room, and rooms, even unfinished ones, asked questions of the structures above them. He crouched and pressed his palm to the floor near the opening. The boards were firm, but the vibration traveled differently now. The house was learning to sit on something new. Stellan did not panic. Panic was wasted motion. He took measurements instead. He checked the spacing between joists, traced the load paths with his eyes the way he once tracked cattle through snow, slowly, deliberately, never assuming the obvious path was the true one. The house was old, but it had been built honestly. The beams were thick, hand-cut, set closer together than modern codes required. Whoever had built it had expected hardship. "That helps," Stellan murmured. He spent the morning reinforcing the floor above the ham, adding temporary supports where the stress concentrated, cutting and fitting each piece of timber with care. Sweat froze and thawed at his collar as he worked. Biscuit followed him everywhere, the dog's nails clicking softly, his body always just close enough to be in the way. Biscuit had developed a habit of lying flat on the floor directly over the ham opening, chest pressed to the boards, as if guarding the space below. His coat was permanently dusted with fine brick powder now, giving him the look of a dog who had aged prematurely into responsibility. By midday, snow began falling in earnest. It was not heavy yet, but it was persistent, each flake small and dry, driven sideways by the wind. Stellan led Aster into the shelter. He had reinforced behind the house, checking the lashings twice, running his hands down her legs to feel for stiffness. Aster stood calmly, her breath slow, ears flicking toward the sound of the wind rather than away from it. She trusted routine. That trust had been earned over years of consistent handling, not affection. "Easy," Stellan told her. "This one's still deciding what it wants to be." Inside, the ham work shifted from digging and stacking to planning overhead. Stellan laid out beams across the brick walls, testing their fit, marking where the permanent ceiling would sit. This part mattered more than most people understood. A roof underground was not just something to keep dirt out. It was the point where gravity negotiated with human intention. June arrived in the late afternoon, snow clinging to the hem of her coat. She stamped her boots at the door and paused when she saw the additional supports in place. "You felt it too," she said. Stellan nodded. The house noticed. She stepped closer, peering down into the space below. The brick walls rose nearly to chest height now, straight and even, the mortar lines clean. The air down there looked different, as if light behaved more carefully around it. "This is usually where people make mistakes," June said. "They think the hard part is done." "It's not," Stellan replied. "It's just quieter." June removed her gloves, rubbing her hands together. Her fingers were ink-stained, a habit from working with old records and charts. She carried a rolled document under her arm. "I brought something," she said, unrolling it carefully on the cleared floor. It was a map, not of roads or property lines, but of weather patterns, hand-drawn and annotated, years of notes layered over one another. This town's had 3 winters in the last 50 years where people died because they trusted the surface, roof collapses, exposure, fires that couldn't keep up. Stellan studied the map. "And the ground?" June met his eyes. The ground didn't fail once. They worked side by side for a while without speaking. June held the lantern while Stellan checked beam placements. Biscuit lay between them, chin on his paws, eyes following every movement. Outside, the snow thickened. Later that evening, another visitor arrived. His name was Wade Harlan, and he did not knock. Stellan heard his boots first. Heavy, confident steps on the porch, followed by the door opening without hesitation. Wade Harlan filled the doorway in a way that made rooms feel smaller. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad, with the dense build of a man who had once worked hard and now worked others harder. His beard was trimmed carefully, his hair combed back despite the wind. His coat was expensive, clean, and cut to signal authority. His eyes were sharp, calculating, the kind that measured land before people. I figured this was where the noise was coming. From, Wade said, glancing around the stripped living room, the exposed floor, the stacked bricks. You've been busy. June straightened immediately. She knew Wade by reputation. Everyone did. Stellan did not offer his hand. It's my house, Wade smiled thinly. For now. He walked closer, peering down into the ham. You know, he said, land like this isn't meant for experiments. Cheyenne's expanding. People want clean lots, stable structures. This is stable, Stellan replied. Wade chuckled. That's what they all say before something collapses. He turned his attention fully to Stellan. I own the property on both sides of you. I'd rather not deal with complications. June spoke before Stellan could. He's not violating any codes. Wade glanced at her, surprised, then smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. June Hart, weather girl. Data analyst, she corrected. Wade shrugged. Same difference. Listen, Crow, I can make you a fair offer. More than fair. You walk away before winter really bites. Stellan held Wade's gaze steadily. I'm not selling. Wade's smile hardened. Pride's an expensive habit. So is rebuilding after failure, Stellan said. For a moment, Wade looked as if he might argue. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. Think about it, he said, already turning toward the door. Winter has a way of changing minds. When he left, the house felt colder. June exhaled slowly. He doesn't like being told no. I've noticed, Stellan said. That night, the wind rose again, stronger now, pressing snow against the windows until the glass disappeared behind white. Stellan worked late, installing the first permanent ceiling beams in the ham. He tested each one with his weight, listening for sound, feeling for give. The space below grew more enclosed, more deliberate. When he finally climbed out, he paused, standing near, in the living room, looking at the floor that now concealed something solid and intentional beneath it. The house creaked once, then settled. He slept briefly, then woke before dawn to the sound of snow sliding off the roof. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The yard was already half buried. Aster stood calm in her shelter, steam rising from her flanks. Biscuit bounded through the drifts, then returned, shaking snow everywhere, tail wagging as if this were a game. Stellan looked up at the sky. It was heavy, low, undecided. Soon, he said quietly. Inside, the ham waited. The ceiling held. The walls stood true. Above, the storm gathered itself. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It lingered at the edges of the sky, gathering patience the way predators did. Snow fell steadily now, not in sheets but in layers, each one settling before the next arrived, adding weight without drama. The temperature dropped a few degrees each night, enough that the house began to behave differently. Wood contracted, nails spoke more often, windows carried a thin rim of ice by morning that did not fully melt by afternoon. Inside, Stellan shifted his focus from structure to survival. The ham was no longer a construction site in the simple sense. It had crossed into something more deliberate. The brick walls stood complete now, rising clean and straight to meet the beam framework overhead. The ceiling was still open in places, but the geometry was settled. This was the stage where small decisions would matter more than large ones. Heat did not forgive carelessness. Airflow punished mistakes quietly. Stellan installed insulation between the beams using salvaged wool batting he had traded for earlier in the week. He worked slowly, packing it tight without compressing it too far, mindful of how heat traveled and where it liked to linger. He lined the ceiling with thick planks, fastening each one securely, testing with his weight before moving on. Biscuit followed him down into the ham now without hesitation, descending the temporary ladder with awkward confidence, nails scraping, tail wagging like this was the best game they had played yet. The dog was clearly more comfortable underground than above, his body relaxing the moment his paws touched the packed earth floor. You're not wrong, Stellan muttered, watching him settle near the wall. The next task was the stove. Stellan had acquired it quietly, the way he acquired most things that mattered. It came from a man named Russell Moraine, a former railroad worker who had lost his left index finger years earlier to a coupling mishap and had never quite forgiven. Machinery since. Russell was in his early 60s, thin to the point of sharpness, with a face carved by wind and disappointment. His beard was white and sparse, trimmed close to his skin, his eyes dark and sharp beneath bushy brows. He had kept the small cast-iron stove in his shed long after he stopped needing it, more out of habit than sentiment. "Still works," Russell had said, tapping the metal with his knuckle. "Holds heat better than most people." Stellan hauled it home piece by piece, reassembled it in the ham's far corner, and ran the flue carefully through the ceiling, routing it into the false chimney he had prepared inside the kitchen wall. The exit was disguised intentionally, vented to resemble an auxiliary exhaust pipe rather than a primary heat source. Anyone glancing at the house from outside would see nothing worth questioning. Lighting came next. Stellan installed oil lamps in recessed wall niches, spaced to minimize shadow and conserve fuel. He tested each one, adjusted wick length, noted burn time. He kept records, small penciled notes in a battered notebook, oil usage per hour, flame stability, smoke behavior. This was not paranoia. This was memory-demanding precision. June arrived just before dusk with a bundle under her arm. She had traded her usual coat for a heavier one now, the fabric stiff with cold. Her cheeks were wind-flushed, her braid tighter than usual, tucked into her collar. "I brought jars," she said, setting them down carefully. "Dried beans, rice, salt. My grandmother used to say salt mattered more than sugar." She wasn't wrong, Stellan replied. June descended into the ham slowly, assessing each step. She stood in the center of the space and closed her eyes for a moment, breathing. "It's different," she said. "The air." "It doesn't move much," Stellan said. "That's the point." She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "It feels held." They worked, together arranging shelves along the brick walls, installing sturdy wooden brackets that could bear weight without pulling loose. Food storage came first, then water, then medical supplies. Stellan kept things spaced, organized by priority rather than convenience. Biscuit supervised from the corner, occasionally standing to inspect a new shelf before returning to his spot. Above them, the house continued to creak, but less sharply now. The ham absorbed more than cold. It absorbed sound. Outside, the town grew uneasy. Snowdrifts blocked side roads. Power flickered in the northern neighborhoods. A barn roof collapsed under accumulated weight 2 streets over. No one was hurt, but the sound traveled, a deep final crack that lingered in the air long after the dust settled. People began speaking in quieter tones. Preparedness shifted from a theoretical conversation to a personal one. Wade Harlan drove past the house twice that day. Stellan noticed the tire tracks. He noticed the way the truck slowed. Wade did not stop this time. He did not need to. His presence alone carried implication. That night, Stellan tested the stove. He lit it carefully, building the fire slowly, feeding it small pieces at first, watching how the heat moved through the room. The temperature rose gradually, evenly, without spikes. The brick walls absorbed warmth and returned it at a measured pace. After 2 hours, the ham held steady at just over 50 degrees. While above ground, the house dipped close to freezing, despite the main heater working overtime. Stellan shut the stove down and waited. The temperature dropped slowly, predictably. No sudden losses, no drafts. June watched the gauge with him. "This would keep people alive, hey?" she said. "Yes." "How many?" Stellan considered the space. "More than 1, fewer than 10, depends how long." June nodded, understanding the weight of that answer. The storm intensified overnight. By morning, the sky was gone, replaced by a uniform white that erased depth and distance. Snow piled against the sides of the house, covering the lower half of the windows. Wind drove flakes into every seam. The sound was constant now, a low, relentless pressure, like the ocean pressed flat against the walls. Stellan moved Aster inside the reinforced shelter and added more straw, more feed. She stood calmly, but her ears flicked more often now, tracking the changing pitch of the wind. Biscuit paced the threshold between house and ham, restless but alert. Midday brought the first knock. It was tentative at first, barely audible over the wind. Then it came again, firmer this time. Stellan opened the door to find Mrs. Elaine Porter standing on the porch, wrapped in layers that did not quite hide her shaking. She was in her late 60s, small and stooped, her gray hair tucked under a wool hat. Her eyes were wide with cold and fear, her lips pale. "My heater's gone," she said. "The pipes froze. I can't—" Stellan stepped aside without hesitation. "Come in." He guided her down into the ham, settled her near the wall, handed her a blanket. The warmth reached her slowly, but it reached her. She exhaled a sound that was half sob, half prayer. "You built this," she said, voice unsteady. "Under your house?" "Yes." She looked at him, truly looked, as if recalibrating something she thought she understood. People laughed. "They won't," Stellan said. "Not for long." By evening, 2 more people arrived, then another. The ham filled with quiet bodies, breath fogging, then easing. The stove burned low and steady. Biscuit curled at the entrance, alert but calm. Above them, the storm screamed. Below, the room did what it was built to do. The storm reached its full weight by the second night. What had begun as pressure and accumulation turned into force. Wind struck the house in long, sustained blows, not howling so much as pushing, as if trying to move the structure inch by inch across the frozen ground. Snow no longer fell in flakes. It traveled sideways, dense and fine, finding every seam the cold could exploit. The world above the ham became a place defined by sound rather than sight. Creaking beams, rattling glass, the distant crack of stressed timber giving way. Below, the room held. The temperature remained steady, hovering just above 50. The stove burned low, its heat absorbed by brick and released slowly, evenly. The air stayed breathable, the ventilation pulling just enough without stealing warmth. Stellan moved through the space in measured steps, checking gauges, adjusting dampers, listening. Leadership, he had learned, was not loud, it was consistent. Elaine Porter sat against the far wall, wrapped in blankets, her small frame no longer shaking. Her breathing had evened out, and she watched Stellan with quiet intensity, as if anchoring herself to the sight of someone who knew what he was doing. 2 other neighbors, Tom Willis and his wife Marlene, occupied the opposite side. Tom was in his early 40s, thick-shouldered and bearded, his face weathered by years of outdoor labor. He spoke little, partly by nature and partly because a workplace accident years earlier had left him with a crushed jaw and a lingering hesitation in his speech. Marlene was slighter, sharp-eyed, her hair pulled into a severe knot that suggested a lifetime of managing problems before they became disasters. They didn't ask many questions. They followed instructions. That, more than gratitude, told Stellan they understood the situation. June sat near the center, notebook in hand, tracking time, fuel use, and temperature shifts. Her calm did not come from denial. It came from observation. She had moved past fear into function, and that steadiness spread quietly through the room. Biscuit lay near the base of the stairs, his body positioned so that no one could enter or exit without passing him. His ears flicked at every change in sound. He was alert, but not anxious, the posture of a dog who had decided this place was worth defending. Occasionally, he rose and circled, checking on each person before returning to his spot. He was young, but instinct had given him authority. The first crisis came shortly after midnight. A sound cut through the steady pressure of the wind, a sharp crack, followed by a drawn-out groan that vibrated through the beams. Stellan felt it through his boots before he heard it clearly. He climbed the stairs quickly, opening the door just enough to look. The front window had shattered inward, the glass buried under snow. Wind poured into the living room, driving cold through the space in seconds. The heater above ground had failed entirely, its pilot, extinguished by the sudden rush of air. Stellan closed the door immediately and turned back to the ham. "No one comes up unless I say so," he said, voice firm but level. "This room stays sealed." He returned to the living room long enough to drag a heavy tarp over the broken window, securing it with nails driven straight into the frame. His fingers numbed quickly, but he worked without hesitation, movements efficient, practiced. He had done this kind of work before, under worse conditions, when hesitation had cost time and time had cost lives. When he returned below, the room barely noticed his absence. "You okay?" June asked. "Yes." That was enough. An hour later, the pounding began. It was not wind. It was irregular, urgent, human. Stellan was already moving before the second knock landed. He climbed the stairs, opened the door, and was met with a blast of snow and a man stumbling forward. The man was younger than Stellan, maybe late 20s. His face, raw with cold, his eyelashes crusted with ice. He wore a thin jacket that had not been meant for this kind of weather, and jeans stiff with frozen moisture. His beard was patchy and untrimmed, his hands shaking violently. Behind him stood a woman clutching a child to her chest, her hair whipping loose from beneath her hood. "Please," the man said, his voice hoarse. "The truck died. We—" Stellan did not let him finish. "Inside, now!" He guided them down, closing the door as quickly as possible. Snow followed them in, but not enough to matter. The woman collapsed to her knees the moment the warmth touched her. The child, no more than 6, clung silently, eyes too large for his face. The man introduced himself once his shaking eased. "Daniel Reed," he said. He worked part-time at a supply warehouse, had moved to Cheyenne less than a year earlier for work. The storm had caught them on the road. He had believed they could make it home. Stellan nodded. He had heard that belief before. More knocks came through the night. Each time, Stellan evaluated quickly: number, condition, space. He didn't turn anyone away who could physically make it down the stairs. By dawn, the ham held 9 people. 9 was more than planned. 9 meant rationing. Stellan addressed it plainly. "We can keep everyone warm," he said. "We can't waste fuel. We eat small, we rotate sleep, and we don't argue." No one argued. The next challenge was air. With more bodies came moisture, breath thickening the space. Condensation gathered along the upper brick courses. Stellan adjusted the ventilation, increasing flow slightly while compensating with the stove. He monitored continuously, checking flame color, listening for changes in draw. This was the part most shelters failed at. People underestimated air until it became a problem that could not be fixed. June assisted without needing instruction. She tracked time, reminded people to drink water, guided quiet. Conversations away from panic. Her presence steadied the room in a way that was difficult to measure but easy to feel. At mid-morning, another knock came, this one heavier, more insistent. When Stellan opened the door, Wade Harlan stood in the snow. He looked different now. His coat was gone, lost or abandoned. His hair was disheveled, his beard rimed with frost. His confident posture had collapsed inward, shoulders hunched against the cold. He was holding a teenage girl, someone else's daughter, her face gray, her lips blue. "Please," Wade said. The word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Stellan stepped aside. The room went quiet as Wade descended into the ham. He avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the girl, who was wrapped in blankets and placed near the stove. She breathed shallowly at first, then more steadily as warmth returned. Wade stood apart, hands clenched, his authority stripped down to something raw and human. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. Hours passed. Above ground, the storm tore at Cheyenne. Roofs collapsed. Power failed across entire blocks. Vehicles vanished beneath drifts. The town became something unrecognizable, reduced to shapes and sounds and cold. Below, the ham endured. People slept in shifts. Leaning against walls, sitting shoulder to shoulder, food was shared carefully. Stories surfaced quietly, not for entertainment but for grounding. Elaine spoke of winters when she was a child, when storms lasted longer, but people were more prepared. Tom described the accident that had changed the way he spoke, how learning to be patient with his own voice had taught him patience with others. Daniel apologized repeatedly for believing his truck would hold. Stellan listened more than he spoke. Leadership did not require narration. Late in the afternoon, Wade approached him. "I was wrong," Wade said quietly. He did not excuse himself. He did not qualify the statement. "If you hadn't built this, we'd be dead." Stellan nodded once. "Sit down. Save your strength." Wade did as he was told. When night fell again, the storm still raged, but its voice had changed. It had spent itself unevenly, leaving destruction where it could and moving on where it could not. The ham remained steady. The stove burned low and true. Biscuit slept for the first time since the storm began, curled in a tight circle, trusting completely. Stellan stood at the base of the stairs and listened, to the people breathing, to the stove ticking, to the wind failing to get what it wanted. The room had done its work. The storm did not end with drama. It loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if unsure whether the land beneath it had truly earned reprieve. By the third morning, the pressure against the house softened. The roar diminished into long, tired sighs. Snow still fell, but it dropped straight down now, without the fury that had driven it sideways for days. The wind had not vanished, but it had lost its authority. Below the floor, the ham felt the change before anyone else did. Stellan noticed it first in the sound. The constant external vibration that had traveled faintly through brick and beam was gone. The stove ticked more loudly now, its metal expanding and contracting without interference. Breathing sounded different too. Less guarded, deeper, uncounted. The room had crossed from survival into endurance, and endurance allowed for thought. He moved quietly among the sleepers, checking on each person in turn. Elaine Porter slept upright against the wall, her chin tucked into set. Her scarf, color returned to her cheeks. Tom Willis lay stretched on his side, one arm curled protectively toward Marlene even in sleep. Daniel Reed sat awake, back against the bricks, eyes fixed on nothing, the kind of stare that came when the body had survived but the mind had not yet caught up. Wade Harlan slept heavily near the far corner, exhaustion flattening the sharp edges of him, leaving only a man who had carried too much certainty for too long. June sat near the stove, notebook open, pencil idle in her fingers. She looked up as Stellan approached. "The pressure's rising," she said quietly. "It's breaking." Stellan nodded. "Not done yet." "No," she agreed. "But it's letting go." They didn't wake anyone. They waited. When daylight finally reached the ham, it came as a pale shift in tone rather than light itself. Stellan climbed the stairs and cracked the door carefully. Cold air slipped in, sharp but no longer violent. Snow pressed against. The lower walls of the house piled high enough to erase familiar lines. The broken window was buried entirely, the tarp frozen stiff but holding. He closed the door again and returned below. "We'll go up in stages," he said, voice carrying easily now that fear had thinned. "One at a time, no rush." It took hours. Each person emerged slowly, cautiously, as if the world above might still lash out if approached too quickly. Elaine cried when she saw the light, her hands shaking as she touched the doorframe. Daniel carried his child up first, shielding the boy's eyes until they adjusted. Tom and Marlene stepped into the living room together, scanning the damage with practical eyes, already cataloging repairs. Wade came last. He paused at the top of the stairs, standing still longer than necessary. The house above bore the marks of the storm clearly now. Snow packed into corners, a collapsed section of ceiling near the entryway, furniture half buried where it had been, pushed aside. Wade took it in without comment, his face unreadable. Outside, Cheyenne looked altered. Snowdrifts rose higher than fences. Cars sat abandoned where they had been overtaken, shapes softened into anonymity, roofs sagged under weight that had not yet been cleared. The air was painfully bright, sunlight reflecting off white surfaces with no mercy. The town was quiet in a way Stellan had learned to respect. Quiet meant counting losses. People lingered near the house, unsure what to do next. No one left immediately. The ham had not just sheltered their bodies, it had anchored them. Leaving it felt premature, like stepping away from solid ground onto ice that had not yet proven itself. Stellan made coffee on a small camp burner in the kitchen, distributing it without ceremony. Biscuit trotted among them, tail wagging now, his energy returning as if he had been storing it for this moment. Snow clung to his fur in clumps. Melting slowly indoors, he accepted attention. Gladly, but did not abandon his habit of checking doors and windows, ever watchful. By mid-morning, the first sirens sounded in the distance. Emergency crews began navigating the streets, their progress slow but deliberate. The town was waking up to what had happened. A man approached the house just after noon, moving carefully through the snow. He was tall and lean, his posture rigid, his steps measured. His face was clean-shaven despite the cold, his hair graying at the temples. He wore a heavy municipal coat and gloves that had seen years of use. His eyes were sharp, assessing, not unkind, but not indulgent either. "Elias Moreno," he said, extending a hand to Stellan. "County Emergency Management." Stellan shook it. "Crow." Moreno looked past him into the house, then toward the people gathered outside. "I've been hearing about this place since sunrise." "I didn't advertise," Stellan said. Moreno smiled faintly. "You didn't have to." He crouched, near the open section of floor, peering down into the ham. He studied the brickwork, the beam placement, the ventilation outlet. You built this yourself? Yes. Moreno straightened slowly. You know how many calls we got from this block? Stellan waited. None, Moreno said. Every other section reported trapped residents, exposure, structural collapse. This house? Silence. He glanced at June. You the one from the weather station? Yes, Moreno nodded. Your advisories were understated. June allowed herself a small smile. Data tends to be. Moreno turned back to Stellan. We're going to need places like this if winters keep behaving this way. Stellan did not respond immediately. He looked instead at the people around him, at the house that had nearly failed and the room beneath it that had not. It's not a bunker, he said. It's a room. Moreno considered that. Then you might want to teach others how to build rooms. The idea settled quietly, without fanfare. Wade approached later, once the emergency crews had moved on. He stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched more from humility than cold. I owe you more than thanks, Wade said. His voice lacked its usual confidence. I pushed, I dismissed, I was wrong. Stellan studied him for a moment. You helped carry people down the stairs, he said. That counts. Wade swallowed. If you decide to expand this, teach it. I can help. Materials, labor, no strings. Stellan nodded once. We'll talk later. As afternoon faded, people began to leave. Some returned to damaged homes. Others went to shelters being set up across town. Elaine lingered the longest, pressing Stellan's hands between hers before she left. You saved us, she said simply. No, Stellan replied. The ground did. That evening, when the house was quiet again, Stellan and June sat on the floor above the ham, backs against the wall, steam rising from their mugs. You know this changes things, June said. Yes. For you. For the town. She looked at him then, really looked. You didn't build this to be a hero. Stellan shook his head. I built it because I didn't want to bury another friend. June reached for his hand and held it without urgency. You won't. Below them, the ham rested. Warm, intact, waiting. The storm had passed. What remained was choice. Winter did not retreat quickly, but it loosened its grip enough for life to resume its quieter negotiations. Snow still covered Cheyenne in uneven sheets, but paths began to form, first narrow, then wide enough for people to pass without thinking too hard about each step. Roofs were cleared. Power returned in stages. The town shifted from survival to repair, and repair carried a different weight. Survival asked only that you endure. Repair asked that you decide what to keep. Stellan Crow did not rush that decision. In the days after the storm, his house became a point of reference rather than a spectacle. People stopped by not to stare, but to ask. Some came with coffee, others with spare tools, others with nothing but questions they hadn't known how to phrase before. Stellan answered what he could and redirected what he couldn't. He did not exaggerate. He did not promise certainty. He spoke about soil density, about airflow, about how heat behaved when it wasn't allowed to. Escape upward without resistance. He spoke the way he worked, plainly, without embellishment, trusting that the facts were enough. June organized the questions. She set up a folding table in the living room, laying out notebooks, diagrams, and copies of weather records. She cataloged names, addresses, building types. She had always been methodical, but now that quality carried urgency rather than habit. She moved through the house with ease, no longer a visitor, but not yet something else either. Her presence was steady, practical, and unmistakably rooted. Most of these houses shouldn't be fully underground, she told Stellan one evening, tapping a pencil against a sketch. But partial shelters? Root depth rooms? Those would change the math. Stellan nodded. People don't need bunkers. They need options. Outside, Aster grazed what she could find beneath the snow, her chestnut coat dark against the white. She had weathered the storm well. The reinforced shelter had held, and Stellan had checked on her often enough that she trusted the routine completely. When he approached, she lifted her head, ears forward, eyes calm. She was 12 now, experienced, sensible, no longer inclined toward panic. The storm had not rattled her. If anything, it had confirmed what she already knew. Preparation mattered. Biscuit, on the other hand, had emerged from the storm with renewed energy. The dog bounded through newly cleared paths, investigating each change in the landscape as if cataloging it for future reference. His coat had thickened noticeably in the cold, giving him a sturdier look, and his movements carried a confidence that had not been there before. He followed Stellan everywhere, but he also made rounds on his own, checking fences, sniffing unfamiliar boots, making it clear that this house, and what lay beneath it, was under his supervision. A week after the storm, Elias Moreno returned. This time, he did not come alone. Two men accompanied him, both younger, both carrying clipboards and measuring tools. One was thin and sharp-featured, clean-shaven, his hair cropped close in a way that suggested discipline rather than fashion. The other was broader, with a thick mustache and a habit of squinting at structures, as if they might lie to him if given the chance. Moreno introduced them briefly as engineers working with the county. They spent hours inspecting the ham. They measured brick thickness, examined mortar joints, traced airflow routes. They tested the ceiling load distribution and the ventilation efficiency. They asked pointed questions, the kind that assumed competence rather than luck. "This wasn't improvised," the clean-shaven engineer said at one point, crouching near the stove. "You planned this." Stellan shrugged. "I listened." Moreno smiled at that. "We'd like to document it, properly. Not to regulate it yet, but to understand it." Stellan hesitated, then nodded. "As long as it stays practical." "That's the point," Moreno replied. Word spread faster than Stellan expected. By early spring, 3 houses on his street had begun similar projects. Not identical, each adapted to its own structure, but guided by the same principles. Stellan walked each site, offering suggestions when asked, keeping his opinions grounded in observation rather than authority. He didn't take payment. When pressed, he accepted coffee, spare lumber, or silence. Wade Harlan kept his word. True to his offer, materials began arriving quietly: bricks, insulation, treated lumber, delivered without announcements or strings. Wade himself came by less often, and when he did, he listened more than he spoke. The storm had altered him in a way that no argument could. He had seen certainty stripped down to fragility, and the lesson had held. One afternoon, Wade approached Stellan while he was helping a neighbor set foundation markers. "I've been thinking," Wade said, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "I spent a long time building things that looked strong." Stellan waited. "Turns out strong and safe aren't always the same," Wade finished. Stellan nodded once. That was enough. As the snow receded, the ham beneath Stellan's house transitioned from refuge to fixture. Shelves were reorganized, supplies were replenished, the stove was cleaned and reassembled with care. The room no longer smelled of urgency. It smelled of brick, oil, and stored warmth. It felt settled. One evening, after most of the town had gone quiet, Stellan and June sat on the stairs leading down into the ham. The door was open, letting warmth drift upward into the living room. The house above still bore scars, patched walls, mismatched boards, but it stood. "You could leave," June said, not accusing, just stating a possibility. "You've done what you came here to do." Stellan considered it. He thought of the roads he had taken before, the way he had measured places by how quickly he could leave them. "I could," he said, "but I don't need to." June smiled, small and genuine. "Good." They sat in silence for a while. Biscuit lay stretched across both their feet, effectively pinning them in place. Outside, Aster shifted in her pasture, snow crunching softly beneath her hooves. Spring arrived slowly. The ground thawed unevenly, releasing water in narrow channels that cut through the remaining snow. The ham held its temperature through the changes, stable and predictable. It had been built for winter, but it belonged to the earth, not the season. On a clear morning in late April, the town held a small gathering on Stellan's street. There were no speeches, no banners, just people standing together, watching as the last of the damaged debris was cleared away. Moreno was there, as were the engineers. Wade stood off to one side. Elaine Porter sat in a folding chair, wrapped in a light blanket despite the sun. Someone asked Stellan what he planned to call the room beneath his house. He looked down at the floor, then back at the people gathered. "It's just a room," he said. "One that listens." That answer satisfied more people than a name ever could. Later that evening, when the crowd had dispersed and the house was quiet again, Stellan closed the ham door gently and rested his hand on the wood. The boards fit as precisely as they had on the first day, seams invisible unless you knew where to look. June stood beside him. "You built something that will outlast you." Stellan shook his head. "I built something that doesn't need me." She took his hand then, fingers warm, steady. "That's how you know it matters." Above them, the house creaked softly, not in protest, but in adjustment. Below them, the ham rested, holding the warmth it had learned to keep. Winter had taken what it could. What remained was choice, memory, and a room beneath the floor that would always be ready. Sometimes God does not send thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes his miracles arrive quietly, in the wisdom passed down, in hands willing to prepare, in a heart that listens instead of laughs. That hidden room beneath the house was not just brick and earth. It was a reminder that God often gives us the answer before the storm, but we must have the courage to believe it, even when no one else does. In our own lives, we all face storms. Illness, loneliness, fear, loss, and not every miracle looks like rescue at the last second. Sometimes the miracle is the strength to prepare, the love that shows up, the shelter we become for one another. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may be facing their own storm right now. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And if you believe that faith, kindness, and quiet courage can still change lives, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories that remind us we are not alone. May God bless you and your family. May he place warmth where there is cold, hope where there is fear, and peace where there has been waiting. And may you always find shelter, both in this world and in his grace.